I feel slightly time conscious tonight. I've been asked to speak for no more than 30 minutes. So it's a bit like the old classic Monty Python sketch, which is trying to condense À la recherche du temps perdu by Marcel Proust down to 30 seconds or whatever it was. So it's going to be a bit of a challenge because there's so much to talk about. But by way of introduction, as Kristen said, I tend to focus these days on three key areas, which in my mind I've condensed down to three wars. So we're looking at the war on terrorism and how that impacts on our societies. We're looking at the war on the internet, and we're looking at the war on drugs. And they may seem disparate, but the reason I pull them together is because, in my view, and with my experience and my perspective, I see that they're all used and abused as a war on us. They are used as pretexts, almost as a stalking horse, if you know that English phrase, to crack down on our freedoms, and as an excuse also to intervene, particularly on the part of the USA, in countries globally. So I also want to thank as well, because I've been invited to Iceland to do talks for law enforcement against prohibition, particularly. The war on drugs is, I think, probably one of the few areas that we are looking at now where we could win an activist campaign globally, possibly, in the next few years. So I will be doing more talks over the next week on the subject of the war on drugs. So how did someone who started out as a spy end up coming to Iceland to talk about the three wars and the fight against the peoples? It was a bit of an interesting journey, and it started, oh God, way back now. I'm getting so old, it's so depressing. Started back in 1990 when I was approached to work for MI5. And this was an interesting time in the spy's history because in the UK we have three key spy organisations. We have MI5, which is officially called the UK Security Service, which at international conferences they used to truncate down to UKSS until one of our German colleagues said that wasn't so good. And they are responsible for domestic security and intelligence gathering. We also have MI6, which are the James Bond wannabes, and we have GCHQ, which is the Government Communications Headquarters, the listening post, and they work very closely with the US NSA. So they're the three key organisations, and they've been around for 100 years, and yet for the first 80 years of their existence, they didn't officially exist. In the UK, there was a system where no MP, no democratic representative, nobody could ever know what they were getting up to or ask questions about what they were doing. And this changed in the 1980s because they had at that point a stinking reputation for investigating striking minors, left-wing activists and things. And there are a number of whistleblowers who came out in the 1980s, most notably Peter Wright, who wrote the banned book Spycatcher. And because of these scandals, the government of the day put them on a legal footing for the first time, starting in 1989 with the Security Service Act, which covered MI5, and then in 1994, the Intelligence Service Act, which covered GCHQ and MI6. And it was only because of that, really, when I was first approached, and they kept reassuring me that now it was different, now they had to obey the law, now they had to uphold civil liberties, that I was even tempted to carry on the recruitment process. So as I said, I didn't mean to be a spy. I was never a spy geek. I wasn't into James Bond. But I applied to be a diplomat. I quite fancied that lifestyle, you know, swanning around embassy parties, swilling champagne. Well, that's what I thought anyway. The reality is not quite like that. And I got a letter through the post about 2 months after I applied, saying that we may have other jobs you would find more interesting. And I thought, it's MI5. I don't know why, it was my first gut instinct, and I was terrified, because why on earth would I want to work for an organisation like that? Unfortunately, I opened the letter in the same room as my father, and my father was a spy geek. He loved all that, John le Carré, James Bond, everything. And also, crucially, he was an investigative journalist. So of course he said, please find out, please. So I rang the telephone number, and a couple of months later found myself in an unmarked building in central London, being grilled about my life from the age of 12. It was very intensive, and about halfway through this process, the woman said, why do you think you're here? And I went, are you MI5? Because I thought, if I've got this wrong, I'm going to look like such a tit. But it was, and they made me sign a notification of the Official Secrets Act immediately, otherwise it would not have continued. Then the whole process went on for months, very intensive, all sorts of role play and psychometric testing, psychiatric testing and everything. And I was very open all the way through. My ethical views have not changed to this day. I was very open about them even then, and they kept reassuring me and saying, it's okay, we agree with you, come and work for us. So imagine my surprise when I first started working there to find that they had lied during the recruitment process. I mean, I was quite naive, I was only 22. And they had told me during the recruitment process that they wanted a new generation of intelligence officers to work as counter-terrorism officers. This was going to be the new hot subject for the 1990s. Of course, by 1990, even MI5 had realised that the Cold War was over and they could no longer focus on counter-espionage and counter-subversion. But my very first posting there was to F2, which was a small section dedicated to investigating left-wing activists in the UK. And then I moved over to the Irish counter-terrorism section and then finished in the international counter-terrorism section. But it was in F2 when I met my former partner and fellow whistleblower, David Shaler, who became very notorious in the UK. And it was during that time that we saw the beginnings of things that made us really concerned about the ethics of what MI5 was doing. They had been spying secretly in the shadows with no democratic oversight on their fellow UK citizens for their democratic political activity. So they had almost 1 million files for people, mainly because they were involved in left-wing politics. Plus they had been investigating government ministers or politicians. So anyone who was potentially going to end up in government had their names vetted with MI5. And if their name came up in the records, that summary of their records was sent to the party leader, and then a decision could be made if someone could go into government or not if they were elected. And this gave us an amazing insight into the scale of the investigations. And it also showed that anyone who was anyone, pretty much, during the Labour administration, when Tony Blair got elected in 1997, had an MI5 file, which I think is a real problem for a democracy, because if the spies have secret information on government ministers, and those government ministers are notionally the democratic masters of the spies, it's the tail wagging the dog. And I'm sure that goes some way, at least, to defining why the Labour government gave so many new powers and resources and staff to the spies when they were in government. When we were in the T branch, which was the Irish counter-terrorism section, we also saw things going wrong. We saw bombs planted by the provisional IRA in the UK that could and should have been prevented. And sure, I mean, organisations can make mistakes, but it's then when they lie to the government and cover them up and don't learn from those mistakes that those mistakes are compounded. And then finally, in the international section, we saw 3 cases which just broke us. We thought we're going to have to quit and try and do something to change this. And this involved, first of all, an illegal telephone tap on a very well-known Guardian journalist in the UK. The Guardian's quite left-wing. MI5 got very excited about the possibility of investigating a left-wing journalist. It was like the good old days. But it was illegal. There was also a case of 2 innocent Palestinian students being prosecuted and convicted for involvement in the Israeli bombing attack in London in 1994. And MI5 knew that they were innocent. In fact, MI5's official assessment after they'd seen all the intelligence as well as all the evidence was that Mossad, the Israeli intelligence agency, had bombed its own embassy in a controlled explosion. Now, if you read that on the internet today, you think, mad conspiracy theory. But this was the formal assessment of a senior MI5 officer. And he said this was for 2 reasons: to shatter a wide-ranging support network in London for the Palestinian cause, and also to improve the security measures around Israeli interests in London, which the Israelis have been pushing for years and MI5 have been pushing against. But the worst case was the assassination attempt that Kristin alluded to. And this was in 1995, where MI6, our James Bond wannabes, got involved in funding an assassination plot against Colonel Gaddafi of Libya. And this intrigues me particularly because of what happened there 2 years ago. So you have a situation where MI6 is approached to offer funding and support by an Islamic extremist group in Libya to try and assassinate Gaddafi. At that time, MI5 had started to investigate Islamic extremist groups as a threat to the UK. So we have MI6 funding these groups and we had MI5 trying to investigate these groups. But crucially, under the UK law, the Intelligence Service Act 1994 that governs our spies, it was also illegal under UK law, because under that act, if they want to do something which is illegal, up to and including attempted murder or assassination, they can, provided they get the prior written permission of the government minister they have to answer to, which is the Foreign Secretary. In this case, they didn't. So we have a situation where MI6 is funding our known terrorist enemies to try and illegally assassinate a foreign head of state, which goes wrong, and then kills innocent people in the attack. Now, I mention this, as I said, because, of course, when we saw the toppling of Gaddafi a couple of years ago, at that point, MI6 and the CIA were going back into Libya and funding exactly the same groups to try and get rid of Gaddafi during the uprising. And they were doing it flagrantly, blatantly, in the public gaze, in the full glare of the media. And they got away with it. They managed to kill the guy. So what had to be kept really secret way back in the 1990s is suddenly acceptable. And I find it really worrying that we've made that moral journey post 9/11 to such a brutalized international concept. Anyway, what to do? As I said, we had not signed up to the intelligence agencies to be involved in terrorist plots. We were trying to stop terrorism in our naive way. So we decided to resign and to blow the whistle. Now, under the Official Secrets Act, there is no legal channel you can go to anywhere. You can't even go to your MP, you can't go to the police. It is illegal to speak about your work to anyone outside the service. The only person we could have gone to was the head of the service, and you can imagine how many complaints are upheld that way. So David, who had some journalistic experience, he'd worked for the Sunday Times before he became a spy, decided to go to the newspapers, get the story publicised, get the media pushing for an inquiry, and hopefully some sort of reform to the intelligence agencies. So he made contact in 1996. He took some documents to prove his bona fides, and then it was a very slow courtship because, of course, there was mistrust on both sides, both the journalists and the whistleblower. So it took almost a year for the whole story to break, and even then, the newspapers was too scared to go full on with the Gaddafi plot. They covered the more low-level stuff like files on government ministers and illegal phone taps. But even so, the story was huge, and we ended up literally going on the run around Europe for a month. It was like some surreal backpacking holiday around the Netherlands, France, and Spain. And we had our flat smashed up in a counter-terrorism style search by the secret police. And that means the floorboards are ripped up, the bath is ripped apart, furniture is smashed, everything. And we saw friends and family being arrested around us. And of course, we faced arrest ourselves. So it was quite a traumatic experience. And unfortunately as well, the timing was slightly off because the story broke, the newspapers and the media were behind us and pushing for an inquiry. And then just when that happened, Princess Diana died in Paris in the summer of 1997. So that was the end of any media protection we'd been hoping for. And you can't factor that into your plans. Anyway, we had 3 years living in exile in France. David went to prison twice, first when the British tried to extradite him from France and failed in 1998. And then secondly, when he returned voluntarily in 2000 in order to stand trial and try and feed the Gaddafi plot into the public record. He, of course, was convicted, and sad to say, since then really seems to be broken. And this is a fate that seems to strike most whistleblowers, because the state will crush them in order to deter future whistleblowers. So we have a situation, I think the worst bit that came out of it was actually listening to the end of the trial, where he wasn't allowed to say anything in his own defence. He'd been hedged around with legal inhibitions. And yet, despite this, the judge in his formal final ruling said that Shayla had done what he'd done in the public interest, that there was no financial motivation, and that no agent lives had ever been put at risk. And yet, despite this, the next day, all the screaming national headlines were precisely the opposite. Shayla sells agent lives down the river for money. And sort of, hang on, where were the journalists in the courtroom? I saw them writing down the official ruling. And this got me thinking and has really sent me on a journey to discover how the media can be controlled by the intelligence agencies, as well as the wider government apparatus, by spin doctors, by lobbyists. And in the UK, it's a very stark example of the corruption of power. So, for example, we have a situation where there is a sort of carrot and the stick. The carrot is the soft power, and the stick, of course, is the hard power. The carrot is very seductive, I think, to many journalists in the UK. They get into a situation where they are approached by someone in the spy agencies. They have a lunch. They're asked just, would you like to take some briefings from us about certain stories we might want to release into the wild? And they say yes, of course, and they get their briefings, and if they don't then rebrief them and print them in the media, the briefings stop. If they, God forbid, want to investigate what they're told and expose something bad, then definitely they're outcast. But then it gets worse, because you get a situation of what is called agents of influence in the UK. And this is where you are already enmeshed in the system and dependent on the briefings. But then they ratchet up the pressure a bit, and they say, well, let us know what's going on in your newsroom. If there's a story that is potentially embarrassing to us, please tell us, warn us ahead. And there have been many cases of agents of influence. In fact, I had dinner with a grand old man of Fleet Street a few months ago, and we were discussing this. He said, oh, of course we've known this has been going on for decades. We always knew who the two agents were in each newsroom, though. So I suppose it gives one hope they might have kept some stories secret. And then you get a situation as well where you get a linkage at higher levels between the editors and the proprietors of the newspapers and the media organisations, and then the top spies and the top politicians. And this has been laid bare in the UK over the last couple of years with the phone hacking scandal, of course. The cosy friendship between David Cameron and, what's she called?
Brooks.
Thank you, Rebecca Brooks, the former editor of the News of the World. And that goes on as well between the spies. And in fact, MI6 has its own dedicated section called Information Operations. Well, it was in the 1990s, they've probably changed that now, which was truncated down to IOPS. And this section was there specifically to plant fake stories and manipulate media coverage of the spies. So this goes on, but this is the sort of soft power. The hard power in the UK, and I'm sure Iceland cannot be as bad as this, is a battery of laws to protect the intelligence agencies. They are the most legally protected and the most legally unaccountable of all spy agencies in Western notional democracies. We have a situation where if journalists try and expose stuff they do not like, they can invoke a whole range of laws. They've used counter-terrorism laws against journalists to try and get them to hand over their notes. They have injunctions. They have super injunctions where you can't even mention there's an injunction in place. The police will be issuing production orders to make you hand over your notes and your sources. They will threaten to go in to newsrooms and ransack the computer records. We have a voluntary organisation called the Defence Broadcast Press Advisory Group, which issues things called D-notices. And this is a bunch of senior media people and senior spies getting together voluntarily to vet what goes into the media. And D-notices are respected. We also have governmental injunctions called PIIs. And then, of course, most notoriously, we have the good old Official Secrets Act, which in the UK doesn't just clobber the whistleblower coming out of the agency, it also potentially criminalises the journalists. So, for example, there were many journalists who were threatened with prosecution during the Shaler case. One of them ended up with a conviction. And it means that under the Official Secrets Act, Section 5, if you report knowingly what a whistleblower is saying, you too will face 2 years in prison if you cause damage to national security. Although national security is a nebulous concept, we have no legal definition for it. Basically, it's the interest of the spy agencies. So even journalists are put at risk, and this is worse even than Russia. So, that shows the parlous state of real UK democracy. So this is what journalists in the UK have to put up with. This is what whistleblowers also have to bear in mind when they want to approach the media. So the final bit I want to talk about really is what needs to be considered if you get that fatal phone call one day saying, hi, it's David Shaler from MI5 and I want to blow the whistle. What would you do? How would you handle your source? How would you protect them? And also the crucial question, of course, is in this WikiLeaks era, what value as the mainstream media could you potentially add to a whistleblower? Because from my perspective, if I was sitting in MI5 now behind my desk, and I saw evidence of crime coming out, and I wanted to do something about it, and I tried all the internal routes, nothing had happened, I'd been told to shut up and not rock the boat again. I would be very, very tempted to at least cache any documentary proof I had on a site such as WikiLeaks. Particularly because through experience I know that if you take documents and give them to newspapers and then they are issued with a production order by the police, they will hand over those documents and you've lost your proof. And then you can be castigated as a fantasist or a conspiracy theorist because the newspaper gave away your proof. So now, of course, any sensible central government or intelligence whistleblower would cache their documents with an organisation like WikiLeaks to protect them. And it also gives them a certain degree of control over how they manage the whistleblowing. Because if you go to a newspaper, you will probably be outed very quickly. If you give something anonymously to somewhere like WikiLeaks, you retain that control. You can dip a toe in the water and see what the public response is like, and then take a decision about whether or not you want to go public yourself. Because if you do go public, of course, your entire life is turned upside down and inside out. But as I said, there is still a role, I think, for the mainstream media, but it needs to be very mindful of the issues at stake. And this goes back to the three wars to a certain extent, certainly the war on the internet. You get that phone call. How do you then protect your source in an era of endemic electronic surveillance, where the government is hoping to be able to just cache all the communications information you have? How can you protect them? And this is where journalists need to become more spy-like, I think, and use the old John le Carré's tradecraft. So you make the initial connection, you arrange to meet, it's quick, hopefully it's under the radar. That can't be guaranteed. But then you take two new cash-bought mobiles, which are clean, and just have each other's number on. And that's the only way you ever communicate electronically. And every time you meet, go to a sort of cheapish hotel where you can get a room, paying cash, there's no prior booking, it's all electronic free. You meet your source, and at that meeting you arrange to meet them again at the next place and time. So again, no electronic trail. But you also need to be aware of some of the laws. So for example, in the UK, evidence gathered from intercepted telephone conversations cannot be used evidentially. Evidence gathered from a property bug placed near a telephone can be used evidentially against you or your source. So, for example, if you have a private conversation, you will give away the intelligence of the story you're working on, but it can't be used in court. But of course, one end of the communication, or both ends of the communication, if there is a property bug there, can be used to put someone in prison. And in the UK, that can involve both the whistleblower and the journalist. So it's just knowing the minutiae of interception laws, what they can do to you, is very important. And also, of course, don't speak at your workstation, and there might be a bug in your computer or nearby. Don't speak in your home, don't speak in your car, all those classic things that you need to avoid so that you're not giving away your strategy, your story, and the whistleblower, and allowing them to end up in court and in prison. So it is a difficult time, I think, for journalists, and this is one of the reasons why it's very important for everybody to get very teched up. And I know that there's going to be a crypto party held on Saturday here in Reykjavik, and I know a lot of journalists worldwide are taking advantage of learning about these basic security steps. So if you're not familiar with it, I do recommend that you go along, and there'll be information available later about where and when, I think. But you have to take this seriously, because as journalists, why would a whistleblower come to you unless you can prove that you can protect them fundamentally, as WikiLeaks has proven to protect its sources? I mean, the only person who's been really outed themselves, the tech has not failed. The other aspect that you can bring, and I'm speaking from a whistleblower perspective, is aftercare, the sort of pastoral care. I've seen so many journalists come and asset strip whistleblowers for information and then run off gleefully with a story. But actually what happens is the journalist makes their career, but of course the whistleblower has broken their career. So if you can offer care and support afterwards, and that fighting, campaigning passion, so that your media organisation will fight for that whistleblower, even when they're going through the court case, even when they're in prison, and even when they're out of it, potentially. Just carry on fighting is very important. And if you are seen to have a track record of writing about stories like that and fighting for your whistleblowers or your sources like that, you will attract more stories as well, which is a purely utilitarian fact, but it does work. This is how whistleblowers will find you. So, as I said right at the start, there is a sort of sense of three wars for me, because we are now working into this era where the war on terror has been used to decimate whole countries across the Middle East. And it's also being used to shred all our civil liberties, our basic hard-won freedoms in many Western countries, so that we can now be spied on with impunity, where the police will infiltrate groups, peace activists and things, where people can be snatched and kidnapped and extraordinarily rendered and tortured with very little comeback. And even in the UK, we are seeing a situation now where they're trying to push through a bill which will legalise secret courts. So if you are snatched, kidnapped, tortured, and you then have the evidence to sue the British intelligence agencies, they will only hear this in a secret court, and you are not allowed to be there, and your lawyer of choice is not allowed to be there. We are truly entering a Kafkaesque era in the West, and I don't think many people are really fully aware of it, and it's not being applied against the vast majority of the populations, but it is certainly being applied amongst certain communities within our populations. And once the laws are there, it's very difficult to wrest those powers back, and we are all potentially at risk, particularly as potentially economic situation declines, people become restive, they start demonstrating. Suddenly we all become potential threats, and they have these powers now to try and crush us. And this is mirroring, the war on terror is now mirroring the war on drugs. The excuse to take away civil liberties, the excuse to intervene for humanitarian reasons in countries around the world that are interesting for whatever strategic region. And for example, in Africa now, we're seeing whole nation states destabilized because of the war on terror or the liberation of Libya or whatever. Whereas in fact, they've been destabilized to such an extent through the war on drugs that they've become narco states, full of corruption, transit points for drugs from Latin America into Europe. And then just finally, to pull it all together, the way that they will survey us in our increasingly connected world is, of course, via the internet. The war on the internet is what I call it, and we need to be aware of that, because we all love Facebook. You know, we go on it and we share things with our friends. That is the spy's wet dream. It's gathering the sort of information that we had to spend weeks getting. You know, who's a friend of whom, and who's dating whom, and where you're going to meet, and what you're talking about. This is doing the job of the spies. So if you're serious about keeping things secret or private, nothing wrong with privacy, it's a basic human right, then I would suggest getting off Facebook pretty sharpish as well. Let's see, they agree. So the concept of cyber terrorism, the concept of this encroachment against our privacy on the internet, and the way that they are using issues like copyright, like piracy, in order to now go into things like inspecting all our private emails, is yet another bogus reason to shut down what should be our basic freedoms of communication, our basic freedoms of access to information, particularly, for example, on our governments. We need transparency in order to have justice, and also even our freedom of self-expression, our freedom of speech, because if we think everything we're writing is being monitored and might potentially be used in evidence against us in future, we will start self-censoring. And that way is, without doubt, the quickest way to the dystopia that Orwell described in his novel 1984. So I can't imagine a time where it's been more crucial to have freedoms, to fight for those freedoms, and for whistleblowers to be encouraged to come out, and for the media to report what they say accurately and fight for them. Thank you very much.
It's a brilliant talk, and it was not 20 minutes, was it?
It was 30, I'm afraid. Sorry.
You could have talked for a minute. Do we have another mic? We're going to open for a Q&A, and you can step up to the microphone, or as we do not have a microphone to pass out, you can just place your question from the seat.
We could repeat the questions or something, perhaps.
We can repeat the questions. But I mean, thanks a lot for your talk. I mean, there are two things I want to ask you about. One thing is Whistleblower Protection Act. What do you think about it? We have one here before Parliament. It's almost 100% certain it's not going to pass into law before election. We have sort of situation here where this is not a total priority at the time. It's a very progressive act, actually, and has had very little attention. But I would like your opinion on what do you think about that as a protection of whistleblowers. Secondly, can you share your opinion of how the Secret Services operate with regard to the perceived threat of cyber terrorism, and whether you believe that these Secret Services use or even create this scenario of such a perceived threat to gain some foothold in foreign countries. You know about this. You know about the recent case.
I do,
you
yes.
know what I mean. But it's, I think it's something that should be of interest to Icelandic journalists. So if we start with those two things and while you think about your questions.
Okay. Thank you. Well, yes, in terms of whistleblower protection, it's a lovely idea, but it never seems to work. And I think with the elections looming, it probably won't even be implemented here. In the UK, we had this discussion in the 1990s. They put something in place called the Public Interest Disclosure Act 1998, which specifically excluded anyone from central government intelligence or the military, which of course are all the places where you're going to see the most heinous examples of corruption or criminality. So that act has been in place, and that act is loathed by whistleblowers coming out of other areas like health or finance. We've had a slew of them emerging, and they are still not protected by the Act. And it's not that the legal protection is not there. It still means, though, that they will be vilified, ostracized by their employers, not allowed to work. They will probably lose their income, and of course then their very way of life goes. And there's always a dirty campaign from the powers that be, from their employers, to discredit them, to shred their reputations. And it's a well-worn path. I mean, we see it with every whistleblower, which is they're too junior to know what they're talking about, they're disgruntled, they were sacked, they don't know what they're talking about. It's the whole range of things comes out every time, no matter what field. And there's been a new organisation set up in the UK called Whistleblowers UK recently to act as a sort of support group for people going through this, because there have been so many, even from the National Health Service, even from finance, let alone the more hardcore areas, and they're still not getting the support they need. So unless an act has real teeth, it's not going to be much protection as far as I've seen, but at least it puts the idea out there to be debated democratically. It gets the issue of whistleblowing and the reasons behind it and why we need it more and more today into the public domain. But yes, having looked at the UK experience, it hasn't been great. In terms of building up possibilities for intelligence actions, I'm certainly no stranger to that. I've seen this time again in the real world. I mean, the UK agencies have been involved in ramping up perceived terrorist threats for their own means for decades. They did it in Northern Ireland. They got involved in a dirty war where there was shoot to kill, where there was collusion between the security services and certainly loyalist terrorists, and ended up planting bombs. And we also saw this, we've seen this time and again as well, since 9/11. And of course as well in the US with the FBI, targeting mentally fragile young men with links to mosques and egging them on to try and make it sound like they're going to carry out some sort of major terrorist coup, whereas in fact they're not. So in the real world, this has gone on time and time again. In fact, there was one other case, I don't know if you remember Alexander Litvinenko, the Russian guy, Polonium-210. And he was always described as a dissident, but he was actually a whistleblower who fled Russia to the UK for political asylum, which I always thought was highly ironic at the time. And what he blew the whistle on was the fact that the KGB, or its current version, the FSB, had been involved in bombing some apartment blocks in Moscow in 1999, in which hundreds of people had died. And this was blamed on Chechen rebels. And this led to the excuse for a whole-scale invasion of Chechnya, which was a complete bloodbath. So this does happen, and it happens across the planet. There is no good country that doesn't get its hands dirty in this way. It's a perfectly standard weapon in the arsenal of intelligence agencies. And now the war has moved, indeed, to the realm of the cyber. Of course, they're going to be using the same tactics. It would be naive not to think that possible. And in fact, we saw that with the attack against the Iranian nuclear power stations, the Stuxnet virus, a few years ago, which of course was denied by Israel, denied by America, and now it has been tracked back to them. So they've let this very dangerous virus out into the wild, which was specifically aimed at a country which was not deemed to be a threat by the national intelligence estimate of combined US intelligence agencies in 2007. And now this is out there being mutated and probably going to be let loose on God knows what. So certainly cyber terrorism is the new big threat. And the concept of ramping up an artificially perceived threat is a very old tactic. And I think in terms of what's going on with Iceland and the sense that the FBI thought, we've got to come in and swoop in like John Wayne and protect the poor Icelandic people from this perceived terrorist threat, is just an excuse to get in and get rummaging around in all your internet services, particularly because you have such a good reputation for looking forward and protecting your freedoms, protecting your rights. And that is why they tried to do that from an outside perspective.
Well, I'm afraid that I have to admit that the outside perspective is not maybe in full compliance with what the reality is when it comes to freedom of speech and journalist freedom and what the police authorities will not do. A few hours ago, a journalist was sentenced to a huge fine for basically quoting an individual that he was interviewed, despite the fact that European Court of Human Rights is constantly slamming national authorities for such a judgment by the Supreme Court. But let's move on to the... any questions? Yeah, Emil.
I'm Emil from Channel 2. Maybe two questions. It interests me when you were elaborating on how MI5 and MI6 work and this connection with journalism and media. We here, of course, know very well how the yellow papers in UK works. There's a scandal story about a parliament member or a minister, and he has to resign. The question is maybe, I have maybe two questions. One about this is, and the question is, do you believe that the MI5 have decided that certain parliament member or minister should go and plant the information, knowing he's having an affair with the shady lady somewhere or whatever, or even worse, with a man, if he's a man, and plant the story that, and the question is, if MI5 decided itself that this person should go, or maybe the Prime Minister gave the order to the MI5, find a way to get rid of him or her. And that's question number one. When you were talking about that the MI5 and MI6 didn't exist for 80 years, it has been in our tiny little country kind of a myth that there is a secret service in Iceland. Nobody knows what it is. Nobody knows who controls it. Is it in the Foreign Ministry? Is it the Department of the Police? But there's always been this rumor that it exists. And now we have been having this request from the police authority in Iceland that they legally get permission for preventive actions. So they can spy on people who have not done anything but might do something.
Thought crime.
Yeah, thought crime. So they want to have that permission, and there's a strong support for it in certain areas in the country. I don't know. I don't know how big percentage of the nation is supporting this, but there is a really considerable part of the country really support this. So that might be the first step, maybe, and you can elaborate on that. That might maybe be the first step to formalize a secret service in Iceland.
Well, I think in terms of the of MI5 actually being used or instructed to ruin people, you need to turn it around. It's actually the perception of the ministers or the parliamentarians or whoever that they might have a file on MI5, and MI5 has all this stuff on them, and it can be used at any time. So it becomes whether or not it's true, it becomes this threat, a self-perpetuating sort of fear, and they start self-censoring again. So, for example, there was a very famous case it was after the whistleblowing, and there was a politician called Jack Straw, who was then, I think, Home Secretary, then became Foreign Secretary. So at the time that we whistleblew, he was the head of the political master of MI5, and he did have a file. And he had a file for being a radical lefty or something in the early 70s, which was inconceivable by the late 1990s. And he said, I know I have a file, but I'm not going to ask to see it. In fact, he wouldn't have been allowed to see it. That's the power the spies have. And it was a sort of interesting question was, well, if he had a file, was he really then a subversive threat to the national security of the UK? In which case, what is he doing being the Home Secretary? Or if, you know, the opposite being, if he was wrongly identified, then how many other people have been wrongly identified? I think there is certainly a lot of information picked up when you're watching someone and you're listening to their telephone calls. You're not just picking up nuggets of hardcore intelligence, you're picking up everything about their private life and mistresses. So, of course, there is information like that. When I was on the inside, I never saw that being used in that way. But that's not to say it doesn't happen, especially now they've solidified their linkages between the spies and the press. There's a formal press office. They have nice lunches with their agents of influence. Of course, stuff gets dropped in. But I never saw personally anything like that being done. What was the second question?
It's about the formalizing of a secret service in Iceland by preventive.
Yeah, well, I gather that there are moves afoot to do that, I read recently. That's not the case, but there was...
It's been suggested to,
okay.
And I mean, the police is asking for authority to extend their power to do sort of preventive action
sure.
against organized crimes and terrorism, of course.
Of course, yes.
Wiretapping, etc.
And that's fascinating because there is a myth that is a secret service, but it doesn't exist here. So we are maybe like, UK was like 30, 40, 50 years ago, but now maybe it might formalize if they get those authorities.
Well, it wasn't a myth. I mean, the UK has always known it's got these services. It's just they were not accountable in any way. I don't remember. God, you see, if I say this, I'm technically breaking the Official Secrets Act. Literally. I don't remember there being representatives from Iceland at intelligence conferences, which were European-wide. That's not to say there would not be a point of contact or a small office within an organisation that people could not go to if they wanted to speak about a certain issue. There would be people who would be trusted and who would be vetted and who would be the contacts. So that's probably what we're talking about. But I can see why there will be moves to try and formalise it, because of course there's this explosion of dangerous people out there now. You know, they might want to have transparency or, you know, hack something or put some information out there about your government or something. They're bound to be dangerous. We can't have that, or free thought. So I can see why this idea of thought crime is giving a push towards the idea of a more formalised organisation. But it's, you know, unless it is locked down with proper accountability and proper meaningful oversight, it will turn into a police state. I mean, at the moment in the UK, we have the agencies which have something called the Intelligence and Security Committee in Parliament overseeing them. But that is only allowed to investigate policy, finance and administration. They are not allowed to investigate allegations of crime or wrongdoing. And it has been admitted by many former top spies and police that they have lied to them and got away with it. So there's no oversight. And if something is set up, unless there is proper regulatory oversight and there is proper accountability, it's a really dangerous path to go down if you haven't had that formalised before.
Just a quick follow-up on that. Do you know any country where there's a proper, meaningful oversight on the powers of the police in that?
No. But I have to say the UK is worse than most.
Okay. So, other questions? I mean, if you want to ask in Icelandic, you know, we can try to translate it over to English if you prefer that.
I was just wondering, because
do you want to
whistleblowers usually get the light thrown away and in retrospect quite severely. Do you, in retrospect, regret what you did? Or do you think that you somehow served public interest? You also mentioned that no one has called for any. There's no.
Well, the question is, did I regret what we did? Do you regret, Rial? No, I do to a certain extent, because I think we were quite naive when we decided to blow the whistle. I mean, we were in our 20s and we thought, yeah, we can change the world. and didn't realise quite how vicious the pushback would be. And this happens time and time again with every whistleblower, serious whistleblower of note, that the state apparatus will be used in an incredibly crushing way. It's not just about the legal penalties, it's about the ruin of reputation is the key thing. They want to cast you as a fantasist or, you know, too junior to know what you're talking about, whatever. They have to destroy your reputation to deter future potential whistleblowers. So not taking that enough into consideration, I think, was unfortunate. And I'm sad for what happened to David. I mean, you know, he had a hell of a time going to prison twice and just, no, it's just a mess. But I suppose I can't look back and say, well, I wish I hadn't done it, because I did. And I've learned amazing things from it, and I've had amazing experiences because I've done this. And I suppose it's given me a perspective where I hopefully, I think, can try and speak out and try and inform other people and get other things going that are good. It's the only way I can rationalise it. But
Hi, my name is Helga. I'm a
Hi.
reporter at Channel 2. Thank you very much for this lecture. I was wondering how your decision has affected your career up to today.
well, yeah, how did my decision affect my career? Well, it kills it stone dead. As soon as you whistleblow on any major organisation, not just the spies, that's the end of your professional career. And it's something I think that's little appreciated, which is why I was talking before about journalism offering pastoral care and fighting for their sources, because you do turn your life inside out and upside down, and you become unemployable in any equivalent professional role again. And this is what destroys most whistleblowers. They don't know how to adapt or what to do. And I remember going through a couple of years thinking, well, what now? You know, I've learned all this stuff. I feel pretty cynical about the world now. What could I mean? Also, because you've gone through all that, it's very difficult then to try and slot back into a normal, whatever that is, life, because people just don't get it. So it's a really, really tough position to be in. And I think I've been fortunate in the support I've had, and I've been fortunate in continuing to evolve and research various aspects and different issues, that I've managed to now sort of find my path where I can write and I can do talks and just about survive, with the help of my wonderful partner, Ian. But it's been a really, really tough 15 years. And certainly the bit in the middle, the dip, was very, very difficult to get through. So that's why I say just be gentle. If you get those whistleblowers, please be gentle with them and realise that is the end of their old life. And they're pretty clueless about where to go in their new life, often.
Oh, there's a question. Sorry.
I'm Stefan from Snarot. With your knowledge of the Western Secret Services, both in Europe and also in America, you said before that the Russian Secret Service had blown up an apartment building in Moscow and blamed it on the Chechens. Would you believe that the Secret Service in Britain, America, or France would do the same?
Well, it's certainly...
Would you be capable of doing the same?
You're asking, would other countries' intelligence agencies...
Yeah. In Europe, with your knowledge of
commit self-inflicted wounds?
In Western Europe, do you think these agencies would do the same?
Well, I mean, two of the cases that we blew the whistle on, two of the key cases were precisely that. Yeah, two of the key cases were indeed that. One was the Israeli embassy bombing, where Mossad, in the view of G91, the senior investigating officer in MI5, his view was that Mossad had carried out a controlled explosion. In order, I don't know, if you read that on the internet, you think crazy, but this was the considered evidence. And this vaguely emerged through the whistleblowing and vaguely emerged through the appeal courts as well, although the judge wouldn't let these people free. And it was a very sophisticated device. It was so sophisticated that the bomb ate its own forensics, pretty much. And most bombs can't do that unless they're professionally put together. Even the IRA, which is very sophisticated, could not make bombs like that. So that certainly happened. And it has been established in Northern Ireland that there was collusion between the spies and the loyalist terrorist groups. And that came out as well in the Barron report into the bombings in Dublin in 1973, where loyalists were blamed, but in fact they'd had help. So this does happen. I think it would be naive to think that it wouldn't continue to happen. And it doesn't mean that everything like that is true. Of course there are terrorists out there and they're trying to do bad things, but it doesn't mean that it's always them. And really, every time something happens and there is an obvious, almost pre-organised play from that for political purposes, it's worth having a think at least and a bit of a dig.
Media graduate, member of Snarot, and I am very concerned with, through the years I've watched a lot of cases where I can see clearly that, well, from my point of view, this has all the remarks of being made up, i.e. something happens, find someone else to blame it, and there is this way of doing it, and there's another way, and you might have heard the story about Mark Stone / Mark Kennedy, who worked with Saving Iceland. There's the other method, well, they will tell you later on. The method used there was, he was suggesting more radical actions, and then you can condemn the whole group. Very clever.
Yeah.
But what I'm concerned with is how it can happen in actually an intelligent society like Britain, that you actually have the proof. Your former husband, David Shaler, he studied 7/7 bombings in 2005, and well, he wrote a lot about it before he could be somehow messed up, and he and many others, they pointed out this very small video which everybody can see from ITN. The interview with Peter Power, have you seen that?
Yeah. Well, I remember that interview live. I heard it. So.
How can that escape everyone? Everyone who sees that and admits this cannot be fake. What does he say? He says the very same morning they were exercising exactly the same circumstances. Bombings on the Ford train station and the bus. Now this happens really exactly like that. This lies. See, what I'm concerned with is how media really works, how it can take the obvious fact, turn it into either the ranting of a maniac or simply exclude it from the top news. How can this actually happen? And then I also wanted to ask you if you did get any knowledge about Echelon. Spy systems.
Yeah. There's a lot there. Yes, the Mark Kennedy, Mark Stone case was fascinating. I'll give you a little bit of history on that because when I first started working in MI5, this was when they were still investigating subversives. And one of the groups we worked with very closely was the section called SDS in the Metropolitan Police Special Branch, which was the Special Duties section, which is precisely the organisation Mark Kennedy ended up working in. So these were full-time police who then went undercover to penetrate activist groups. And at that point, MI5 was working with them. And then MI5 closed down its investigation of subversion in the mid-1990s. The police then took on the whole thing. And then the SDS was hived off to something called the Association of Chief Police Officers, ACPO, which everyone thinks in the UK is some sort of union or federation for senior police officers, and it's not. It's a private limited company. So we have these state undercover cops working for a private company, and they carry on investigating all these activist groups and expanding their investigation of these activist groups, and penetrating them both politically and, of course, sexually, as it turned out. So it was a real mess, and of course they're being sued. And this is another reason they want the secret courts. So these cases will be heard in secret. So that's a mess, and that is again a sort of case of mission creep, of how once there is no real oversight, they can do more and more and get away with it. So yeah, that does happen, and that is a real issue. In terms of the 7/7 stuff, I'm not a huge expert on it. I mean, this was around the time David and I were separating, but certainly I'm aware of the Peter Power interview that you mentioned. So this is a former top police officer from the Metropolitan Police Counter-Terrorism Command, who had resigned and set up his own private security company as a consultant. And on the day of the attacks, was running a security exercise across London, simulating a terrorist attack, precisely those 3 stations and the bus, as you mentioned. And he went on national TV twice that morning in the immediate aftermath of these attacks and said precisely what you said, which was they had been running this thing and when they realised the operation had gone live, as he put it, the hairs stood up on the back of his neck. And I remember listening to this live, and I just, what? So I don't know, but the fact is it's been disappeared down, out of the mainstream media. And the other thing that is happening in the UK, for example, is that they are using a law that says every time someone clicks on a newspaper page, that story is being republished, technically. So what is happening is that in newspapers like The Guardian, The Times, The Telegraph, with old media archives, now are disappearing old stories which are embarrassing. A lot of the Shayla stuff has disappeared off the Times website. Dates and times I knew when they appeared, they've gone. And this is because they're using these copyright and security laws saying if you re-click it, it's a republication and you're breaking the Official Secrets Act or you're breaking someone's copyright or whatever. And this is how they are purging the old archives. And it's actually quite frightening to watch. So there's that. The other question you asked was about Echelon. Yes, I do know about it. Yeah. In fact, I'm a friend of Duncan Campbell, who was the investigative journalist who broke this way back in the 80s and then picked it up in the 1990s when he gave evidence to the EU about it. And this case we have the NSA in America listening to all our communications. Outside America is what they're legally allowed to do. We have GCHQ in the UK listening to all our communications outside the UK, which is what they're legally allowed to do. And we also have the equivalent organisations in Canada, New Zealand and Australia. And they share the bulk of what they hoover up. So for decades, the way it has worked is that GCHQ, if they wanted to listen to someone in the UK, couldn't technically do it, legally do it. So they'd ask their mates in the NSA to do it for them from outside and then get the product. And of course, it worked the other way too. So it subverted the strict notion of democratic oversight, and it subverted the laws of the land in terms of who you're allowed to listen to. This has been going on for decades. And now, of course, they're trying to introduce this FISA, or I think it's just been signed into power by Obama, hasn't it, in America, the Foreign Intelligence Something Act, Secret Act, thank you, where they are saying, well, FISA can do this legally now and openly and perhaps listen to Americans in America, and isn't it terrible? But what nobody in the media in America certainly picked up was the fact it's been going on for decades under Echelon. So every which way, they will pay, they will give mouth service to the idea of oversight or working within the laws, but they will always find a way around it every time.
I think the case of Mark Kennedy is often, I think it's extremely ironic, just to add to that information, that when environmental activists in Iceland were protesting this huge dam project for the eastern part of Iceland, and were of course unfamiliar with modern tactics of activists, and they sent a request to the UK, can you teach us how to protest? And what did they send? The guy who was... so, I mean, Icelandic activists were actually trained in modern activist tactics by the Metropolitan Police, which is absolutely ironic. I mean, and now actually in Britain, now I think 6 women have launched a case against Mark or the Metropolitan
Kennedy
Police.
is what it is, yeah.
And he has actually launched a case against the Metropolitan Police for putting him into the position to having to sleep with all the women. But on that note, it's interesting to me because has not been cleared in our society. In your opinion, in your expert opinion, would a person infiltrating society abroad, like Mark Kennedy here in Iceland, would he do it without the full knowledge of somebody within the Icelandic establishment, within the Icelandic authority, and without prior permission? What do you think?
Well, technically he should get, or there should be some permissions given at some level, some awareness that there might be an operation on your sovereign turf. But it doesn't always happen that way, as you've seen recently with the FBI case as well. They pretty much go where they want. But the protocols are, internationally accepted protocols between intelligence agencies are that you at least ask permission. So at least they know. And in fact, it's to protect the host agency, because if something blows up or whatever, literally or not, then at least they have foreknowledge. So that's a messy one. But I mean, this idea of infiltration is just so standard. I mean, there was a case, I think, in the Netherlands. We recently were in London with a bunch of whistleblowers from the FBI and CIA, GCHQ, whatever, for an award ceremony. In fact, it was in Oxford. It was the Sam Adams Associates for Integrity and Intelligence. And this is a big annual award that's given to people from the intelligence agencies who display integrity, strangely enough. It's very difficult to find winners, but there one or two come up every year. And we had this big event, and in fact, we all went along and had dinner at the Ecuador Embassy as well with Julian Assange. And it was a very interesting evening. And getting all these people together was fascinating, because we're all from different agencies. There was Ray McGovern from the CIA, Tom Drake from the NSA, very current case. He's just got off facing 35 years in prison. Colleen Rowley, who blew the whistle a decade ago and was Time Person of the Year. Catherine Gunn blew the whistle in the run-up to the Iraq War from GCHQ. So there are a whole bunch of us all discussing the same trajectory, the same process that we went through, and the same threats that we were facing. And it was very interesting because we were there to give an award to Dr. Tom Finger, who was indeed the man who pulled together the National Intelligence Estimate of 2007 that I mentioned earlier, which stopped a rush to war in Iran. We basically said there is no development of nuclear capability there. So we had this big event in Oxford, and we invited all the press, all these internationally renowned whistleblowers, and The Guardian came along, and The Guardian did a hit piece on one former prize winner who was there to speak. All these other people were former prize winners, and they all spoke. They got no mention whatsoever, nor did Dr. Tom Finger. The only person who was mentioned in this Guardian hit piece was Julian Assange, and all they focused on was Sweden. No mention of anything else. It was shocking. It was shocking. Anyway, I've gone off a bit of a rant there. I was going to talk about Mark Kennedy. Yes, so one of the things that we were discussing over this dinner, my partner is Dutch, and there was a case where a Maoist group was set up in the early 1970s in the Netherlands. And it was actually a fake organisation. The whole thing was organised by the state. All the key players were state operators. And it was designed to flush out other people who would be interested in the subject. But it became so successful because all these people were used to managing projects and were very efficient that they got invited over to China to meet the Mao Zedong, or whatever his name was at that point. So they were all undercover cops, undercover spies, and they got invited over to meet the communist leader in China. So that's, you know, they can be very effective. But it was interesting because it was through your conversation with Ray McGovern, ex-CIA, retired now, who was very aware of that whole case, wasn't it? That
he was actually the CIA recipient of that intelligence.
Yes. So, you know, it's not just infiltration, it can be whole fake groups or campaigns can be set up. And that's also something to be aware of. And one final addenda to that is it's not just the state spies that people need to be aware of these days. There's been a massive growth, since 9/11 particularly, in mercenary spy companies, the corporate spy companies. And these are the ones that tend to be used by corporations who want to build dams that the environmentalists oppose, or who want to build another runway at an airport, the environmentalists or peace, or whatever. These corporations, if they think that activists can cause them damage or embarrassment, will hire these corporate spies. So there was one slightly flippant estimate a few years ago where someone claimed that if you go to any peace demonstration, 1 in 4 of them are going to be a spy of some description. So, beware.
Any more questions? No? I promised Anna that we will be
Thank you.
very informal tonight, and we might actually she might stick around for a bit.
Absolutely,
afterwards, and join an informal discussion, which is the Icelandic way to do it in many ways. So I think I'll sort of formally thank you for your presentation. I think I'll ask you to give her an applause.
Thank you very much.